Resuming debate, the honourable member for Sturgeon River Parkland.
Here. Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And, you know, it's a pleasure to rise today in the House of Commons. And I've been here about 6 months now. And, you know, every single day it's just such a privilege and an honour to be here with members of all parties, because I think we're all here for the right reasons. We want to serve Canadians to the best of our abilities and in the best interests of our constituents. And sometimes we have different ideas of what's best for our constituents, but I know in our hearts we all want to do what is right. And I rise to speak on the issue of the main estimates and this Liberal government's extraordinary use of Vote 40 to circumvent parliamentary oversight and accountability. You know, we're debating this today because of how uncommon the circumstances are surrounding these estimates. For the first time outside of a major economic crisis, the government is using measures to spend over $7 billion with little parliamentary oversight. And now the Liberals are claiming that they're doing this to improve accountability and transparency, but outside of their own echo chambers and outside of the musings of some mandarins, there is little to substantiate those claims. And for those of you watching at home, I would like to outline the importance of the main estimates and their role in the budget process. Main estimates are a tool used by the government to allocate funds from Treasury Board to various departments, based upon the estimated amount of funds needed to achieve government's policy goals. Now, sometimes these estimates do fall short, and supplementary estimates are used to allocate further funds. And this is usually done because of unforeseen circumstances, such as a natural disaster or an economic catastrophe like the 2008 recession. Now, estimates are also an essential tool for parliamentarians to hold government accountable, because they provide the means by which we measure government spending and also hold them to their commitments should the spending go higher than the estimated, or should spending fall short of their commitments. Now, recently, one of the most important debates regarding the main estimates has been taking place in this chamber and has also been taking place in some committees, although we have seen this government unwilling to engage in debate or in even talks about this matter at committee. And I'm specifically talking about Vote 40. Now, Vote 40, in the words of the Parliamentary Budget Officer, is a novel innovation by the government. And a similar measure was used most recently during the 2009 recession as an extraordinary means to get critical funding out the door. Now, the purpose at the time was in the face of a rapidly deteriorating economy, and government stimulus was needed to protect jobs. And the fact that this was such an extraordinary circumstance justified the use of this measure. However, it has not been used for day-to-day purposes until this government has decided to use it. And today, the Liberal government, ostensibly in its efforts to streamline the budget process, has decided to use this measure, but in reality, it will reduce accountability and transparency. Now, to get to the crux of the matter, the Liberal government is voting to allocate over $7 billion without telling Canadians or parliamentarians what those monies will be spent on. In recent committee testimony, many departments that came before the committee were unable to explain what the monies they were receiving in the vote would be used for. And in some cases, individual departments are being allocated hundreds of millions of dollars and can't even explain what the plans are to spend those monies. Now, this isn't chump change, Mr. Speaker. This is hundreds of millions of dollars of taxpayer resources that could be going towards paying down mortgages, paying for their children's education, or saving for their retirement. And Canadians expect that when they pay taxes, that they can trust that the government will spend on things that are important to taxpayers. And most importantly, that there is transparency regarding what those things are and what the outcomes of those things will be. Now, Canadians don't write blank checks to the government, and they certainly do not want to give the Treasury Board Secretariat, which is a department that most Canadians know very little about, and the authority to spend money without Parliament's oversight. Now, my constituents in Sturgeon River Parkland, like most normal Canadians, don't want to spend their time thinking about the nuances of the Treasury Board submissions or funding guidelines, but they rightfully expect me, as their Member of Parliament, to care about these things on their behalf. And they expect me to hold government accountable, whether that be if my party is in government or if we're in opposition, to ensure that those funds are spent and are spent in a way that is measurable, that is transparent, and fundamentally subject to parliamentary oversight. Now, we can't take this issue lightly, Mr. Speaker. The actions of Parliament today set the precedent for Parliament in the future. And by going down this route today, the government is opening the floodgates that will erode some of the means by which parliamentarians and indeed Canadians can hold their government to account. Now, in case some back home are wondering if this isn't just something that their Conservative member of Parliament is blowing out of proportion, I want to direct them to comments made by the Parliamentary Budget Officer, who is a nonpartisan official, and his mandate is to scrutinize the government and their actions. In his own words, he says, in regards to Vote 40, that the money requested for Vote 40 is effectively asking Parliament to provide funding in advance of scrutiny. Now, drawing some historical parallels, in the 17th century, the King of England, Charles I, sought to spend money without parliamentary oversight. He refused to even allow Parliament to convene when they would not give him what he wanted. It led to a civil war, and as a consequence of Parliament winning that civil war, we gained the privileges in the Westminster system that we have today. And one of those privileges is chiefly the right of oversight over government spending decisions. Now, what this government has labeled as reform may help the government get money out the door faster, but they are undermining accountability and transparency in their efforts to do so. And that's not a trade-off my constituents are willing to make, and it's not a trade-off that I am willing to make. In fact, much of the information surrounding this spending will not be available until after the next election, effectively giving the government what many of my colleagues have called a slush fund to spend on whatever they may want before the next election, with little oversight for us as parliamentarians or for Canadians in a whole. In effect, they are going to be denying Canadians the evidence that they need to render a verdict on this government until after the next election. Now, how are Canadians to know, especially when we're talking about deficits that were supposed to be $10 billion and are now $20 billion going year after year? How are we supposed to get a sense of what the value is for those monies when the government has now been setting a precedent through this vote to spend $7 billion without government oversight? How are Canadians supposed to have that accountability? I also know that the Auditor General is very concerned, in a much more general manner. In a recent document and report, he outlined his concerns with this government's spending plans. Now, to paraphrase, he said, with this government, I quote, "The measure of success has become the amount of money spent rather than approved outcomes." This is a damning assessment from the Auditor General that casts doubt on whether taxpayers' resources are being used in the best manner by this government. Instead, it looks like just trying to shovel it out the door as if it's a virtue to spend taxpayers' money rather than spending it for the best possible result for Canadians. Now, in committee, my colleague from Edmonton West has been holding the government's feet to the fire to try and get some transparency over this $7 billion appropriation. And the government is playing a game of ping-pong with the opposition, telling them to ask department officials what the individual funds are allocated for. But when those department officials are asked, the departments will claim that it would be preposterous for them to know what the money is going to be used for. This level of stonewalling occurring on this measure is truly astounding. And for the government to so frivolously administer taxpayer funds are truly disturbing. Now, it's troubling, Mr. Speaker, the Orwellian newspeak coming out of this government, whether when Conservatives ask about how much the carbon tax will cost Canadians, the Liberals claim the information's out there. But when we ask for the information and access to information, they will black out the documents to hide the true cost to Canadians' families. And day after day we ask, and day after day they refuse to answer. And we see also that this government increasingly wants to move their spending off the books so that Canadians don't get to see how it is spent. They are trying to interfere with the Canada Pension Plan, our national retirement savings, to bail out the government's disastrous intervention on the Kinder Morgan pipeline, an intervention that would not be necessary at all if this government had just stood up for the energy industry and unequivocally backed this pipeline in the national interest, instead of standing back and letting this project fall apart under their watch. Now, they've also created this new infrastructure bank, and they're shifting resources that could have been used for infrastructure in communities to this bank so that it reduces transparency. And finally, to what we're talking about today, Vote 40, where the Liberals claim they want to improve accountability and transparency, but they're actually removing parliamentary oversight and asking taxpayers to trust that the government knows best. Now, my constituents demand better from this government. They demand transparency and accountability on how this Liberal government is spending their money. And I look forward to spending tonight voting to hold this government accountable for their carbon tax cover-up, and I look forward to the months to come where I will continue to fight for my constituents to hold this government accountable. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.